Welcome to night 21 to fall asleep fast. This is a quiet place where you don't need to focus, remember, or do anything at all. You can simply listen or let the sound fade gently into the background. If it feels right, you can softly like this video now or leave a calm comment sharing where you're listening from and what time it is. There's no need to rush. Everything here moves slowly. Tonight, we explore the forgotten art of medieval map-making in Monsters of the Unknown Oceans. A calm and unhurried story from the past, told gently, without urgency and without expectation. You don't need to stay awake for it. You don't need to follow every detail. If you were here last night, welcome back. And if this is your first night, you can begin right here, exactly as you are. A new night will be waiting for you again tomorrow. But for now, allow your breathing to slow, your thoughts to drift, and let this story quietly carry you toward rest. The sea lay open beneath a sky that changed its colors slowly without announcement. Along the edges of the known land, waves folded themselves over and over as they had done for centuries, indifferent to how much or how little was understood about them. Fishing boats moved close to shore, their hulls dark against the pale water, never straying too far from the comfort of sight. Beyond them, the horizon rested in a quiet line, neither inviting nor refusing, simply present. In that time, the world felt wide in a way that is difficult to measure. Not wide because it had been traveled completely, but wide because so much of it had not. The edges of knowledge did not end with firm borders. They softened. They faded. The land was held in memory and story, in trade routes and familiar harbors, but the sea stretched outward with a patience that seemed endless. Coastal towns rose from stone and timber, their narrow streets turning inward from the wind. Nets hung to dry. Salt clung to wooden beams. The rhythm of life remained close to the shoreline, shaped by tides and returning boats. People knew the curve of their own bay, the pattern of currents near their harbor, the way certain clouds gathered before a storm. These were forms of knowledge carried in the body, passed quietly from one generation to the next. Yet even as daily life continued in steady repetition, there was an awareness, soft and unspoken, that beyond the visible waters lay distances unmeasured. The ocean did not declare itself as danger. It did not promise discovery. It simply extended. The further it stretched, the less it was named. In monasteries and port cities alike, travelers brought accounts of distant shores. These accounts arrived like fragments of fabric from a larger cloth. A trader might describe a coastline where the sand gleamed pale under a different sun. A sailor might recall waters warmer than those at home, where unfamiliar birds circled overhead. Such recollections were not assembled into certainty. They lingered instead as impressions, like faint sketches waiting for clearer lines. The land itself felt more stable. Roads connected towns. Rivers marked boundaries that could be traced. Forests had edges known to those who lived near them. But the sea resisted that same clarity. Its surface shifted daily, and beneath it lay depths no one could see. Even when ships ventured outward, they carried with them only partial understanding, guided by stars and habit rather than complete maps. At dusk, when the light thinned and the sky softened into shades of indigo, the ocean seemed to widen further. The boundary between water and air blurred. The world did not feel small or enclosed. It felt suspended, as though much of it remained gently folded beyond reach. This sense of openness was neither troubling nor triumphant. It simply existed, like a long breath held without strain. In certain harbors, simple charts were kept, rudimentary outlines of coastlines known through repeated travel. These were practical, modest tools. They did not attempt to describe the whole of the sea. They concerned themselves with what was near, with rocks that threatened hulls and safe inlets where ships could rest. Beyond those drawn edges, there was space left untouched. That untouched space carried many meanings. For some, it represented possibility. For others, it was a reminder of limits. But in most cases, it was simply accepted. The world was vast. No single lifetime would be enough to contain it. Morning light would return, laying silver paths across the water. Boats would depart, following routes tested by memory rather than ink. The horizon would remain steady, neither closer nor further than before. And in the quiet repetition of these days, the sense of the world's breadth settled into the rhythm of living. It was not a world obsessed with filling every gap. Blankness did not demand immediate correction. Empty stretches of sea were not failures of knowledge. They were reflections of the present moment, honest acknowledgments of what had not yet been seen. In the minds of those who watched the water from stone piers, imagination moved gently across that distance. It did not rush. It did not insist. It wandered much like the tide itself. There were thoughts of islands, of lands that might lie beyond the farthest visible line. These thoughts were carried quietly without urgency. The sky above offered guidance in its own patient way. Constellations wheeled slowly through the seasons, steady and reliable. Mariners learned their patterns, finding direction in their quiet constancy. Even so, the stars could not illuminate every corner of the sea. They could guide but not fully define. As years passed, small additions accumulated, new stories, slightly extended routes, hints of shores further than before. Each addition did not shrink the world so much as reshape its outline. The unknown shifted rather than vanished. What had once been distant became nearer, and what lay beyond that grew softer and more undefined. In this way, the world remained wide not because it was untouched, but because it was continually unfolding. The edge moved gently, like a shoreline reshaped by the tide. There was no single moment when the vastness disappeared. Instead, it lingered, resting at the margins of awareness. And somewhere, in rooms not yet entered, individuals began to consider how such a world might be gathered onto a single surface. How coastlines might be traced with steadier hands. How the pale spaces could be acknowledged without being forced into certainty. For now, however, the sea continued in its quiet expanse. Fishing boats returned at dusk. Lanterns flickered in harbor windows. The horizon lay undisturbed beneath the slow turning of the stars. The world still felt wide, and in that wideness there was room, not only for distance but for careful attention. Attention that would soon settle not on the open water itself, but on tables of wood and stretched parchment, where the vastness would begin, slowly and patiently, to take form. In rooms built of stone and timber, away from the wind and the salt of the open shore, the wide world was invited indoors. The transition from horizon to table happened without spectacle. It was not marked by ceremony but by routine. A heavy wooden door closed softly against the outer air. Footsteps moved across worn floorboards. A shutter was drawn partway to temper the light. Within these rooms the sea did not roar. It rested instead in memory, in description, in the measured intention of those who sought to give it form. The walls were thick, holding both warmth and silence. Shelves carried rolled parchments tied with cord, small wooden boxes filled with pigments, weights of smooth stone used to keep pages flat. The air carried the faint scent of beeswax and drying ink. Dust drifted slowly in the path of light that entered through narrow windows, turning in place as though time itself had slowed. At the center of the room stood a table broad enough to hold an unrolled sheet of parchment. Its surface bore the marks of long use, shallow cuts from blades, faint circles where ink pots had rested, darker patches where oil from steady hands had been absorbed over years. This table was not merely furniture. It was a surface upon which distance was reduced, where coastlines that had taken months to sail could be traced in the span of an arm's reach. The cartographer bent over his work without urgency. His posture was shaped by habit rather than haste. He did not attempt to conquer the page in a single sitting. Instead, he approached it as one might approach a garden, returning daily, tending small sections, adjusting lines that required patience. The world was not forced into shape. It was coaxed. Light played a gentle role in these rooms. During early hours, sunlight filtered through high windows, pale and steady. As the day leaned toward evening, candles were lit, their flames small and unwavering. The glow of wax illuminated the parchment in warm tones, softening edges and quieting contrast. Under such light, even uncertainty appeared gentle. In these spaces, knowledge did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments. A traveler might bring a description of a distant port, noting the curve of its harbor or the direction of prevailing winds. A merchant might recount how long it took to sail between two known points. These accounts were received not with excitement, but with consideration. They were weighed against existing lines, adjusted carefully, and integrated into the growing image of the world. The room itself absorbed these stories without echo. Stone did not repeat what it heard. It held sound briefly and then released it into stillness. The cartographer's tools made only the softest noises, the faint scratch of quill against parchment, the muted tap of a knife trimming an edge, the quiet settling of a weight placed to keep the page from curling. There was a rhythm to the work. The hand would move steadily, then pause. The eyes would narrow slightly, not in strain but in attention. A line once drawn might be retraced, thickened by the smallest degree. Space on the page was never filled thoughtlessly. Even emptiness required deliberation. Around the table lay instruments shaped by craft and time. Compasses of metal, their points sharp and deliberate. Straightedges worn smooth from use. Small brushes for applying color in delicate washes. Each tool had its place, and each was returned to that place when its moment passed. Order in the room reflected a desire for clarity on the page. Outside, life continued as it always had. Carts rolled over uneven streets. Bells marked the passing hours. Ships departed and returned according to tide and season. Yet within the cartographer's room, time seemed to move at a slightly different pace. It was measured less by bells and more by the gradual emergence of form from blankness. The parchment itself commanded respect. Before any line was drawn, it was unrolled slowly, smoothed by careful hands. Its surface carried faint irregularities, subtle variations in tone and texture that reminded the observer of its origin. It was not a perfectly uniform sheet, but a living surface once part of something breathing. Now it bore the responsibility of holding oceans. When the first line touched the page, it did so without flourish. A coastline began as a quiet curve, tentative yet intentional. The cartographer did not imagine himself as master of the sea. He acted instead as its interpreter, translating reports and observations into visible form. Where certainty ended, he did not press forward recklessly. He allowed the line to rest. Silence in the room was not empty. It was filled with concentration so steady it became almost invisible. Even the flame of the candle seemed to understand its role, leaning only slightly, never disturbing the calm. At times, several maps lay side by side, older versions beside newer attempts. Differences between them were subtle. A bay extended a little further, an island shifted slightly in position, a river mouth adjusted to better align with recent accounts. Change entered gradually without drama. The world on parchment matured slowly, shaped by accumulation rather than revelation. The cartographer's awareness extended beyond the immediate task. He understood that the page before him might travel far from this room. It might rest on a ship's table, exposed to damp air and shifting light. It might be folded and unfolded countless times. Yet this awareness did not hurry his work. It only deepened his care. As evening lengthened, shadows grew softer along the walls. The room seemed to draw inward, holding its quiet more closely. The page on the table, illuminated by candlelight, appeared almost luminous against the darkening space around it. In that gentle contrast, the drawn lines felt both fragile and enduring. There were moments when the cartographer would lift his hand and simply observe. The map was not yet complete, nor did it aim to be. Completion was a distant concept, always slightly beyond reach. What mattered was the steady progression from blankness to form, from scattered accounts to coherent outline. The wide world that had once stretched beyond the horizon now lay within the boundaries of parchment, not diminished but distilled. Its breadth had not vanished, it had been translated into scale. Oceans that required weeks to cross could now be traversed by the movement of a fingertip. Yet even reduced in size, they retained their quiet dignity. And as the room settled deeper into evening, attention shifted almost imperceptibly from the drawn lines to the very surface that carried them. The texture beneath the ink, the fibers that absorbed each stroke, the way light caught in the faint grain of the skin. The work would continue, but before new lines extended further into the sea, there would be a pause. A return to the materials themselves. To the careful preparation of parchment, to the mixing of ink, to the patient readiness of hands that understood the importance of beginnings. The page waited before any line extended across it. In the dim, steady light of the room, the parchment lay open and unmarked in its widest spaces, holding within its pale surface a quiet readiness. Before it could receive coastlines or currents, it required attention of another kind. Attention not to distance but to texture. The making of parchment had begun long before it reached this table. Animal skin had been cleaned, stretched upon a wooden frame, and scraped carefully with curved blades until it thinned into a surface both durable and responsive. That earlier labor left subtle traces. When the cartographer ran his fingertips lightly across the page, he could feel faint variations, places where the fibers held more tightly, places where they softened. The surface was not uniform, and it was not expected to be. Its irregularities were accepted as part of its nature. Before ink ever touched it, the parchment was prepared again. A fine powder might be dusted lightly across its face to reduce oils. A smooth stone could be drawn gently over the surface, polishing it until it carried a faint sheen. These gestures were unhurried. They did not seek perfection, only readiness. The tools assembled beside the page held their own quiet history. A small knife rested within reach, its blade worn from years of trimming edges and scraping away errors. A pumice stone lay nearby for softening rough spots. A ruler, straight and carefully preserved, would guide certain lines but never dominate the hand that used it. Ink itself began as fragments. Soot collected from the blackened underside of a lamp was mixed with water and a binding agent, sometimes gum derived from trees. Minerals could be ground with patient pressure in a shallow mortar, their pigments released slowly under the steady turning of a pestle. The grinding made a low, rhythmic sound, neither loud nor intrusive. It was a sound of transformation. When the ink reached the right consistency, it was neither too thin nor too thick. It flowed from the quill with gentle resistance, leaving a mark that settled into the fibers of the parchment without spreading too far. Achieving this balance required familiarity more than calculation. The cartographer relied on touch and sight, adjusting with small additions of water or powder until the ink behaved as it should. The quill itself had been shaped with care. A feather, often from a goose or swan, had been cut and trimmed, its tip split to allow ink to travel downward in a narrow channel. The angle of the cut influenced the thickness of each stroke. Over time the quill wore down, its points softened by use. It would be trimmed again, reshaped gently with the knife, restored to readiness. Before beginning any new section of the map, the cartographer paused. He considered the portion of the page where the line would begin. He did not rush to fill space. The blankness carried its own presence. To draw upon it required a kind of quiet permission, as though asking the surface to receive what would be placed there. When the first new line of the day emerged, it did so with measured steadiness. The quill moved slowly, guided not only by reports and memory, but by the subtle resistance of the parchment beneath it. Each stroke left a faint sound, a soft scratching barely audible beyond the table. That sound marked the meeting of material and intention. Mistakes, when they occurred, were addressed without alarm. A small error might be scraped away carefully with the knife, the blade angled just enough to lift the ink from the surface without cutting too deeply. The area would then be smoothed again, prepared once more to receive a corrected line. The parchment bore these corrections quietly, its surface layered with adjustments that often went unnoticed by the casual observer. Color, when added, was introduced gently. Mineral pigments mixed with binding agents were applied with small brushes, filling certain shapes with muted tones. Seas might be left largely uncolored, their emptiness speaking through the pale surface itself. Landforms could receive faint washes, suggesting terrain without overwhelming the clarity of the lines. Each edition respected the balance between detail and restraint. The work unfolded according to daylight. In morning hours, natural light revealed the subtle texture of the parchment most clearly. As afternoon approached, shadows shifted across the table, altering how ink appeared against the page. The cartographer adjusted his position accordingly, turning the parchment slightly or leaning closer to ensure consistency. There was patience in these movements, but not slowness born of reluctance. Rather, the pace reflected understanding. A map was not simply drawn, it was built gradually, layer upon layer. The preparation of materials was as essential as the lines themselves. Without proper care, ink could fade unevenly, parchment could warp, colors could dull. In quiet intervals between strokes, the cartographer might rest his hand, observing how the ink dried. Fresh lines glistened briefly before settling into matte stillness. Their final tone often deepened slightly as moisture evaporated. The transformation was subtle but steady, like the slow change of light outside the window. The tools, once used, were cleaned and returned to their places. Quills were wiped carefully. Ink pots were covered to prevent thickening. Parchment not currently in use was rolled loosely or covered with cloth to shield it from dust. These gestures formed a routine that protected both material and intention. Even the smallest details demanded attention. The spacing between lines, the curve of a shoreline, the placement of a symbol, each required consideration of proportion. A coastline drawn too boldly could overshadow neighboring features. A river placed slightly off course might distort the sense of distance. Balance was maintained not through rigid measurement alone, but through a cultivated eye. As the hours passed, the page began to carry more of the world within it. Yet this increase did not feel crowded. The prepared surface absorbed each addition calmly. Its earlier blankness was not erased, only transformed into shape. Toward evening, when candlelight replaced the sun, the texture of the parchment appeared different. Shadows softened the grain. Ink lines seemed warmer, less stark. Under this glow, the relationship between hand and material felt even more intimate. Each movement of the quill was illuminated by a small circle of light, beyond which the room receded into quiet darkness. In such moments, the act of drawing became almost meditative. The cartographer's breathing settled into a steady rhythm. His hand moved with familiarity born of repetition. The materials responded predictably, their behavior understood through long acquaintance. The world, once wide and distant, now rested upon a surface prepared with care. Yet even as new lines approached the edges of known lands, the hand hesitated before venturing further. There were coastlines already confirmed through repeated journeys, ports whose shapes had been described consistently. It was toward these familiar forms that attention would next turn, solidifying what was trusted before extending outward again. The quill hovered lightly above the page, poised to trace the contours of shores already spoken of many times, their curves steady in memory. The quill touched the prepared parchment gently, guided first to lines that were familiar, traced many times in memory and on earlier sheets. The coastlines unfolded slowly under the steady hand, curves deepening into bays, jutting promontories outlined with care. Each stroke followed a rhythm that had grown natural over years, the subtle resistance of the surface beneath responding to deliberate pressure, allowing ink to settle precisely where intended. Harbors took shape next. Simple inlets where merchants had long moored their ships appeared as subtle indentations along the margins of the drawn land. The shapes were neither exaggerated nor adorned. They existed as quiet markers of place. The cartographer's eye measured each against the others, ensuring harmony and proportion without hurry. There was no rush to complete the page, no need to fill every space immediately. The quiet act of shaping known land was its own reward. Rivers emerged, following courses long remembered rather than freshly discovered. They curved naturally, occasionally splitting into small channels that fed marshes and inlets. Forests were suggested with gentle hatching, not detailed illustrations, conveying only enough to distinguish one region from another. Even mountains were reduced to soft, rising forms, rendered with light, parallel strokes that hinted at their slopes without demanding attention. Each element existed in relation to the whole, maintaining a balance that invited calm observation rather than active scrutiny. The hand moved slowly, occasionally pausing to compare a line with a distant memory, to adjust a curve that seemed slightly too sharp or too gentle. There was no urgency. Time in this space was measured in the gentle extension of form rather than by hours on the wall clock. The quill lifted and returned, following a silent conversation between intention and surface, between what was known and what had yet to be considered. The room around the table remained still, aware only of its own steady rhythms. Candlelight flickered softly across the parchment, tracing the outlines of land in warm glow. Shadows lengthened as the day waned, providing contrast that enhanced the subtleties of each stroke. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beams, moving with patience, carrying tiny reflections of light across the page. The cartographer's presence was quiet, but deliberate, each motion reinforcing the rhythm of creation without imposing upon it. Edges of the drawn lands often met blank stretches of parchment, where the unknown lay in wait. These boundaries were respected. The hand did not leap to fill them hastily, nor did it linger anxiously. Instead, the familiar shapes were deepened, clarified, and repeated, reinforcing knowledge of the places already confirmed. There was a gentle satisfaction in this repetition, a reassurance in marking what had been experienced and remembered. Small adjustments refined the coastlines further. Bays were softened, peninsulas slightly extended or tapered, and rivers' mouths aligned with the indentations of the shore. Each correction was minor, almost imperceptible, yet together they gave the page coherence. The map, still incomplete, gained a quiet authority, an understated presence. It did not call attention to itself. It merely existed, a patient reflection of the world as it had been known. Inlets and coves were marked with delicate precision, sometimes indicated by faint lines suggesting docks or mooring points. Their subtlety allowed the viewer's eye to linger without haste, moving along the coast naturally, as though following the flow of the water rather than the dictates of a hand. Even in these details, the rhythm remained unbroken, a sequence of small gestures building upon one another in harmonious pattern. The quill's movement continued steadily, touching each familiar line, reinforcing them, yet leaving room for the unknown beyond. The page was becoming more complete, not through addition alone, but through patient reiteration of what was already certain. Every stroke reaffirmed the mapmaker's careful memory, the accumulated wisdom of travel and report, the quiet understanding that some boundaries were ready to be drawn, while others must wait. Light changed gradually with the day, softening and warming the parchment surface. Shadows shifted along the drawn forms, highlighting the gentle curves of the land. The interplay between illumination and ink offered its own quiet guidance, reminding the hand where attention had been given and where it could pause. The world on the page seemed alive, but in a manner measured and gentle, not hurried or restless. Even as more of the coastlines were defined, there was a consciousness of what lay beyond. The sea, vast and uncharted, remained open, its spaces untouched. This allowed the cartographer to linger on the familiar shores without anxiety. There was no pressure to extend the land endlessly, no need to define waters that had yet to be encountered. The calm of the known complemented the mystery of the unknown, each giving context to the other. In the pauses between strokes, the cartographer would examine the page from different angles, adjusting slightly, lifting the inked lines with soft corrections. Attention fell to the alignment of islands near the coast, small rivers feeding into bays, and the spaces between mountains suggested by light hatching. Each minor consideration reinforced the quiet order of the page, building clarity without insistence. Time in this chamber was measured by the subtle movement of light and the unhurried tracing of lines. Hours could pass unnoticed, marked only by the progression of the drawing, the gentle settling of ink, and the rhythm of repeated gestures. Even as the page filled slowly with known shapes, the map remained unfinished in a natural, patient way, inviting further exploration without demanding it. With every familiar curve traced, the cartographer felt a connection to the world beyond the room. He was not simply recording. He was preserving memory, translating what had been observed into a language of line and proportion that could be read without words. The act of drawing itself was gentle, thoughtful, and measured, a meditation sustained over hours. By the time the candlelight had settled fully into the corners of the room, the familiar shores lay traced upon the parchment, firm yet delicate. The spaces of blank sea beyond their edges hinted at journeys yet uncharted, possibilities deferred. In this calm attention to the known, the hand prepared naturally to turn toward the waters that separated lands, to follow currents into the quieter territories where myth and imagination gently lingered. Beyond the traced shores, the open waters stretched across the parchment like a quiet, boundless horizon. Here the ink had not yet fully settled, and the page seemed to breathe beneath the quill's gentle weight. The cartographer approached this space with deliberate calm, aware that each sweep of the line carried a sense of distance and depth, even in its absence of familiar form. The sea was suggested rather than defined. Broad, soft strokes of ink hinted at currents, while faint washes of color marked shallower regions. There were no labels shouting for attention, no symbols demanding immediate interpretation. The expanse was quiet, empty in the most inviting way, leaving room for the imagination to drift over its surface without urgency. It was a place that could be looked upon and simply accepted, a place of rest within the act of creation. Light from the candles played across the page, settling gently over the waves that were yet to be named. Shadows softened the contours of ink, giving them depth without drama. Dust motes turned slowly in the warm beams, tracing lazy paths that echoed the meandering flow of imagined currents. Even the hand that guided the quill moved with a quiet patience, as though the water itself had dictated the pace. The cartographer's attention shifted from line to texture, following the gentle resistance of the ink against the fibers of the parchment. Each motion was deliberate and slow. There was no need to hurry across the blank spaces, no pressure to fill the unknown with immediacy. Instead, the artist lingered, allowing the expanse to unfold naturally under careful observation. A single sweeping motion might trace a soft suggestion of a distant current, a subtle bend that hinted at a bay far beyond the familiar shores, leaving the rest of the page open and unmarked. The sense of scale remained present without insistence. Small islands might be indicated with light dots of ink, placed sparingly, often near the edge of the mapped seas. The space between these markers and the coastline provided a sense of breathing room, a gentle reminder of distance without sharp delineation. The uncharted waters were not threatening. They were simply wide, still, and patient, waiting for the hand to consider them in time. At times, the cartographer paused completely, lifting the quill to observe the entire spread of the page. The light shifted across the table, highlighting faint irregularities in the parchment and revealing the subtle variations in ink that suggested depth and motion. These moments of stillness were as much part of the process as the lines themselves. The room held its breath along with the artist, sharing the quiet expectancy of untouched seas. The expanses were occasionally punctuated by small, tentative marks, dots, dashes, or faint symbols, left in areas that might later receive more attention. Their purpose was gentle and contemplative, a quiet acknowledgement of the unknown rather than a claim upon it. These early indications invited thought without disturbance, offering an unspoken guide for future work, and a sense of presence without intrusion. Reflections of the candlelight danced upon these marks, shifting subtly as the flames wavered. Shadows lengthened across the page, softening edges and creating delicate gradients between ink and blank parchment. In these gradients, the sea seemed to ripple quietly, the movement implied rather than illustrated, a calm suggestion of waters vast and unbounded. The room's air carried faint warmth from the flame, mingled with the soft aroma of dried ink and the slight musk of the parchment, anchoring the senses in gentle awareness. Every so often, the cartographer adjusted a stroke, curving it slightly to align with an imagined current or deepening a line to hint at a distant shoal. The corrections were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they preserved a harmony across the page. Each careful gesture reinforced the sense of calm, of the steady, patient observation of a world still forming, even within the confines of ink and fiber. The open waters on the page allowed for a rhythm of movement and pause. The hand would trace a curve, then hover, observing, considering, adjusting, then move again. There was a meditation in this rhythm, a slow conversation between the creator and the blankness that stretched beyond the familiar lands. In this conversation, the sea was not empty, it was receptive, carrying hints of memory and imagination alike, a place where thought could wander without urgency or interruption. In corners of the page, subtle indications of rougher waters appeared, slightly darker strokes or a soft wash suggesting a change in depth or the approach of a shoal. These touches were minimal, serving only to offer variety within the calm. They were never alarming, never demanding attention. They existed as gentle reminders that the sea, even when vast and unknown, carried character and dimension, quietly acknowledged by the hand that drew it. Throughout the evening, the transition from daylight to candlelight altered the perception of these waters. Shadows softened, colors warmed, and even the faintest marks gained subtle presence. The parchment responded to the change in illumination with patience, showing how light could enhance the depth of empty space without asserting itself. The cartographer observed this transformation with mild appreciation, making small adjustments only when they enhanced the gentle flow of the uncharted seas. The open spaces encouraged imagination in a way that was calm and unobtrusive. Shapes of clouds drifting over the ocean could be imagined, currents meandering lazily, distant winds caressing invisible sails. The mind might wander over these blank expanses as easily as the quill itself, encouraged by the lack of pressure or demand. This duality, between hand and page, between imagination and creation, defined the quiet pace of the work. Evenings deepened, and the room remained steady, its shadows long and comforting. The cartographer's movements had become slow, almost ritualistic. Each dip of the quill into ink, each gentle stroke across the surface, maintained a rhythm that allowed the page to accumulate detail without urgency. The uncharted waters, vast and patient, accepted each addition with quiet grace. As the hand traced currents and indicated distant islands, it began to consider the margins of the seas, where imagination and report might mingle. Here, the notion of creatures or unknown beings would be suggested subtly, without intrusion, marking territories that lay just beyond the familiar and reinforcing the calm rhythm of the map's growth. Along the edges of the uncharted seas, subtle shapes began to emerge, almost imperceptible at first, as if the parchment itself suggested them. The cartographer's quill hovered lightly over the pale surface, tracing gentle curves that hinted at figures beneath the waves. Each mark was deliberate yet soft, leaving room for imagination to fill in motion without imposing form. In these spaces, the sea seemed to breathe, carrying whispers of life that had never been fully seen, yet always known in the stories passed along the shores. The creatures were suggested with the lightest touch. A fin here, a curling tail there, drawn with an almost imperceptible variation in line thickness, enough to suggest presence without intrusion. They did not dominate the page. They were companions to the water, harmonizing with currents and empty spaces alike. Even their eyes, if suggested, were mere impressions, darkened points that glimmered faintly under the candlelight. There was no urgency to detail, no insistence on clarity, only the quiet acknowledgement of the unknown. Ink moved slowly across the surface, the quill lifting and dipping in a measured rhythm. The cartographer adjusted pressure to allow the shapes to float lightly upon the parchment, leaving traces that felt ethereal, suspended between imagination and record. Each stroke was mindful, controlled, yet as delicate as the reflection of moonlight on distant waves. The parchment accepted them without resistance, its fibers cushioning the motion, allowing each figure to exist in gentle suggestion. The placement of these forms was guided by careful observation of the page as a whole. No creature crowded another. Distances were maintained as though the beings required solitude, moving in the vast, open expanse of water. Islands and shoals marked earlier were left untouched, providing calm reference points amidst the subtle presence of the sea's whispered inhabitants. Balance was preserved through restraint, and restraint brought calm. Light continued to shift across the room as candles flickered and shadows danced on the walls. The parchment, with its pale expanse punctuated by the faint marks of creatures, seemed to hold its own quiet life. Each subtle curve of a tail or undulation of a fin cast a small shadow that shifted with the flame, making the figures appear to swim slowly across the surface. The effect was understated, almost hypnotic, yet wholly calm, a gentle movement that invited contemplation rather than alertness. The hand that guided the quill moved steadily, neither hurried nor tentative, maintaining continuity between the familiar shores and the newly hinted creatures of the deep. When a shape did not feel right, it was erased gently with the blade, the fibers polished and prepared once more to receive the stroke. Corrections were soft and measured, preserving the unbroken rhythm of work. Each adjustment deepened the intimacy between hand and page, the act of creation as soothing as the water it represented. At times, the cartographer paused entirely, observing the placement of each figure. Even in these still moments, there was a sense of gentle motion, imagined currents carrying the forms through the blank spaces. The mind traced patterns in the sea, imagining the subtle interactions of creatures with each other, with islands, with the unseen depths below. These mental wanderings were slow and unhurried, echoing the pace of the hand that would eventually render only the faintest hints of them. The margins of the page became a delicate boundary, where the known and the imagined met. Here, the creatures existed as much in suggestion as in form, their presence a reminder that the seas held more than could be contained by lines alone. They were companions to the mapped world, not obstacles or surprises, gently extending the sense of space without demanding notice. The cartographer honored this quiet coexistence, allowing each figure to exist without forcing definition. The rhythm of ink and quill continued through the long hours of the evening. Candles flickered lower, casting warmer glows that made the lines appear almost alive. Shadows elongated over gentle waves, enhancing the subtle three-dimensionality of each shape. Even the smallest mark, a fin or an undulating tail, gained depth as the flame reflected off the fibers of the parchment. It was a slow transformation, unhurried and soft, much like the movement of water itself. Resting the hand, the cartographer would sometimes observe the entire composition from a slight distance. The creatures blended into the open seas, forming a delicate pattern of suggestion rather than imposition. Islands, coastlines, and the uncharted waters now hosted traces of life, quiet and contained, breathing across the page in harmony with what was already drawn. The interaction of ink, surface, and imagination created a meditation in stillness, a gentle narrative unfolding without need of words. Soft washes of color were occasionally applied, barely perceptible, to hint at shadowed depths or the subtle distinction of underwater terrain. These additions were made with slow, considered motions, enhancing the quiet presence of the creatures without drawing attention from the broader calm of the sea. The result was an interplay between suggestion and form, one that maintained the meditative pace established from the beginning of the map-making. As night deepened, the candlelight continued its dance across the parchment, reinforcing the interplay of line, shadow, and suggestion. Each creature remained poised, neither advancing nor retreating, a gentle witness to the stillness around it. Even as the world of the map expanded with known lands and hinted life, the overall tone remained unbroken, soft, measured, and calm. In these hours, the act of creating became inseparable from the act of observing. The page, the quill, the ink, the faint shapes, they existed in a quiet balance. The hand moved with intention, yet with no urgency, each mark contributing to the gentle rhythm of the map's unfolding. The creatures, the open waters, and the familiar shores together formed a unified expanse, a world that could be traced without disturbance, explored without haste, and imagined without insistence. Beyond the traced shapes and subtle hints of life, the cartographer considered the broader margins, where ornaments and symbols might eventually appear. These spaces remained quiet for now, holding the potential to guide the eye softly without ever demanding focus. The sea, filled with whispered presences, extended naturally toward these areas, inviting the hand to continue its slow, contemplative journey across the page. The edges of the parchment, previously reserved for empty space and the soft whispers of sea creatures, now received gentle adornment. The cartographer's hand moved with deliberate calm, selecting simple motifs that would enhance the sense of the page without crowding it. Small flourishes traced along the borders, following the natural rhythm of the waves and the subtle curves of coastlines. Every line and curl was measured, never hurried, each movement a quiet meditation in motion. Delicate swirls suggested flowing water, echoing the currents just traced across the seas. Tiny sprigs of imagined vegetation hinted at distant marshes or riverbanks, integrated seamlessly with the curves of the borders. They were not detailed illustrations, they did not demand attention. Instead, they invited the eye to wander slowly along the edges, to pause for the briefest moment and then continue without urgency. The decorative elements existed in harmony with the spaces of empty sea and inked land, their presence reinforcing the calm rhythm of the map. The quill dipped gently into the ink, and the hand traced a pattern of undulating lines that suggested both movement and tranquility. Each stroke connected subtly to another, forming a continuous rhythm that carried the eye along the perimeter of the page. In some corners, small, repeated shapes hinted at flowers or abstract forms, integrated with natural patterns observed in the world. These designs were intentionally soft, their presence understated, contributing to the overall balance without overwhelming the composition. Candlelight flickered across these ornamental edges, highlighting curves and shadows that shifted as the flame moved. The cartographer adjusted the pressure of the quill, allowing lines to fade in and out softly, giving a sense of depth and gentle movement. Shadows of delicate strokes extended and contracted with the light, creating a quiet interplay of ink and illumination that made the page feel alive without haste or tension. As the hand continued its careful embellishments, the rhythms of creation remained slow and unbroken. Each flourish was given time to settle, each curve considered in relation to the neighboring line. When one shape seemed slightly out of place, it was adjusted with the lightest touch, polished and softened, so that the whole composition retained its meditative flow. The edges became a subtle guide, leading the eye naturally from one corner to another, while the inner areas of the map remained open for the land and seas already drawn. In some spaces, small loops and arcs were added to mirror waves or suggest gentle ripples near the coasts. These lines were not literal, only evocative, reflecting the motion of water and the movement of wind over distant lands. Their repetition created a quiet cadence, a rhythm that extended beyond the simple act of drawing. The page, once bare, began to resonate with this soft, ordered energy, inviting attention without insisting upon it. Occasionally, the cartographer would lift the quill entirely, observing the symmetry and flow of the borders from different angles. Light shifted across the parchment, and the ornamental marks seemed to settle differently with each adjustment. The pauses allowed the mind to wander slowly, imagining distant landscapes, drifting clouds, or the faint ripple of currents along the traced coastlines. These reflections were as much a part of the process as the ink itself, reinforcing the gentle, contemplative pace of the work. In corners where the parchment curved slightly, the hand traced loops that suggested the ends of curling waves or faint spirals of wind. These were never prominent. They were hints, quiet acknowledgments of movement and space. Their subtlety allowed the eye to rest, tracing each form without hurry, noting each as part of a wider, harmonious whole. The act of ornamenting became a dialogue between hand and page, imagination and memory, every motion echoing the calm of the uncharted seas beyond. Some areas of the borders included tiny, repeated patterns, reminiscent of seaweed or flowering grasses swaying in a gentle breeze. Their forms were minimal and soft, drawn with a delicate consistency that reinforced balance. The rhythm of these additions mirrored that of the inner map. No area was rushed, no section emphasized above another. Each stroke contributed to the overall sense of calm, the page evolving with patience and care. The quill's movement, steady and measured, created a sense of continuity with the earlier tracings of shores and sea. The ornamental lines were extensions of the same careful attention, responding to the natural curves of the coastlines and the delicate suggestions of unseen creatures. They provided structure without dominance, decoration without distraction. Together with the traced lands and hinted waters, the borders framed the world gently, enhancing the narrative flow across the page. Light shifted subtly in the room, softening shadows and highlighting the delicate curves of the ornamental lines. Dust motes continued their slow drifting paths, reflecting the glow across the subtle ink. Each adjustment of the quill reinforced the tranquility of the space. The movement of hand, ink, and light combined to create a meditation in stillness, a visual rhythm that could be observed without alertness, a gentle flow that mirrored the calm of the cartographer's mind. Over hours, the borders gradually gained consistency, repeating subtle motifs that harmonized with one another and with the inner map. Small loops, swirls, and lines suggested motion, echoing the undulating currents, whispering of wind, and the distant presence of hidden creatures. Every addition respected the emptiness and openness of the seas and lands within, never competing for attention, merely enhancing the quiet unity of the map as a whole. Even as the candles burned lower and shadows stretched, the work remained measured and unhurried. The cartographer's focus on the edges created a sense of calm that extended inward, connecting land, sea, and subtle life into a single, continuous vision. There was no urgency, no pressure to finish, only the gentle flow of hand, ink, and imagination unfolding in harmony. As the borders of the page began to carry their quiet ornamentation, the attention naturally drifted inward, where the fine lines of coastlines, rivers, and currents awaited further refinement. The delicate decoration of the edges guided the eye, prepared to bring focus slowly back to the details within, encouraging the next phase of the map's creation. Within the inner expanse of the map, where the land met the sea in soft, curving lines, the cartographer began to refine each shape with deliberate care. The edges of coastlines were smoothed and softened, the contours adjusted to flow naturally, reflecting the gentle undulations of hills and valleys that lay beyond the imagination. Each adjustment was made slowly, with attention to the balance of space and proportion, ensuring that the forms remained restful to the eye, yet full of quiet presence. The water, previously indicated by broad strokes and light washes, received gentle shading to suggest depth and subtle movement. The cartographer applied faint gradients of ink, layering them delicately so that currents and shallow areas hinted at themselves without insistence. No line was harsh, no contrast demanded attention. Instead, the page held a quiet rhythm, allowing the viewer's gaze to drift over the contours of bays and inlets as if floating gently across them. Rivers and streams were traced with the softest touch, winding through the land in slow, deliberate curves. Their paths were never rigid, never straight. They followed imagined topography, hinting at gentle slopes and hidden valleys. Each waterway connected with the coastline and with larger rivers beyond, creating a natural flow that felt organic, balanced, and calm. The subtle variations in line thickness and shading lent the sense of movement without animation, a quiet suggestion of life carried by the waters themselves. Patches of forest, lightly indicated with soft patterns of leaf-like impressions, were placed sparingly. Trees were not drawn in detail but suggested with gentle clusters of texture, allowing the mind to fill in the shapes without requiring focus. These areas of greenery followed the gentle slopes and valleys, echoing the contours of the land and providing visual rest among the softly rendered rivers and shores. The forested areas were peaceful, unmoving, yet alive in their quiet presence. Small hills and elevations were hinted at with faint, curving strokes, almost imperceptible, blending into the surrounding terrain. Each mark suggested form without demanding recognition, creating a sense of depth through subtlety rather than contrast. The cartographer's hand moved slowly across the page, lifting and lowering the quill in a meditative rhythm, attentive to the gentle harmony of land, water, and light. Shading along the shores followed the imagined slope of the land into the sea. Gradations were applied with patience, softening the boundaries between water and land. The lightest strokes suggested shallow sandbars or gentle tidal flats, while slightly darker tones hinted at deeper waters or small coves. Each addition was considered and placed without rush, the effect a continuous, uninterrupted flow from one feature to another. Islands, previously indicated with small marks or dots, were now refined into soft, recognizable shapes. Their contours were adjusted to match the general rhythm of the surrounding waters. They appeared neither prominent nor distant, existing instead as a calm complement to the broader expanse of the ocean. The cartographer allowed each form its quiet space, avoiding overdefinition or repetition, preserving the restful pace of observation. In some areas, faint textures were applied to suggest terrain, such as rocky outcrops or sandy stretches. These textures were minimal, soft enough to be almost abstract, yet precise enough to convey the essence of the land. Every addition contributed to a feeling of gentle cohesion, a world that could be observed slowly without insistence, where the eye could wander freely across the map without being drawn sharply to any one point. The movement of the quill was continuous and deliberate. Each curve, each line, each subtle variation in shading flowed from one to another, a quiet conversation between hand and page. Moments of pause were frequent, allowing the cartographer to observe the effects of light and shadow on the textures, ensuring the transitions were smooth and unbroken. The process was meditative, the act of refinement inseparable from the act of observing, each enhancing the other. The candlelight continued its soft dance across the page. Shadows shifted subtly, highlighting curves and textures in ways that seemed to deepen the sense of space without demanding focus. Dust motes drifted lazily in the glow, reflecting faint light across the pale parchment. These small movements were noticed only in passing, adding a delicate sense of life and impermanence to the otherwise still composition. As the refinement progressed, the cartographer considered the interplay between the shapes of the land and the movement of the water. Rivers were gently adjusted to meet the sea at natural angles, coastlines softened to avoid abrupt intersections, and small inlets were hinted at with subtle curves. The goal was not accuracy in the modern sense, but harmony, a balanced, flowing landscape that conveyed a quiet, enduring presence. Gradually, attention shifted to subtle patterns within the water itself. Currents were refined with gentle, looping strokes, tracing invisible flows and movements that suggested a living sea. These lines intertwined with the shores and islands in soft dialogue, reinforcing the connection between land and water. The patterns were quiet, harmonious, and unobtrusive, a delicate rhythm beneath the broader forms of coastlines and rivers. Even small details, such as the slight curvature of a hill or the gentle tapering of a stream, were treated with care. Each mark served to enhance the unity of the composition, ensuring that no element felt isolated or abrupt. The eye was invited to wander, tracing the continuous, flowing forms, absorbing the subtle variations without needing to distinguish or name them. Time passed gently, measured not by minutes but by the slow unfolding of the page. The cartographer remained attentive yet relaxed, allowing each section to develop naturally. Adjustments were made gradually, with patience, ensuring the whole map retained a soft and restful quality. In this meditative state, the boundary between creation and contemplation was blurred. The act of refining became a quiet immersion into the world depicted on the page. Even as the room darkened and shadows deepened, the subtle interplay of land, water, and soft textures maintained its tranquil presence. Each carefully placed stroke, each delicate gradation of ink, contributed to a unified, calming expanse. The map became a gentle companion, its forms suggesting worlds that could be observed slowly, with eyes and mind relaxed, the pace entirely unhurried. The refined details naturally guided attention toward broader harmonies across the page, suggesting continuity and connection between previously drawn elements. Streams, hills, and coastlines now flowed with a quiet cohesion, their forms complementing the ornamental edges and the subtle presences of creatures in the margins. The inner map, once sketched in rough lines, had matured into a soft, meditative landscape that encouraged prolonged, restful observation. Where land and sea met in soft, gentle curves, the cartographer allowed the two to blend seamlessly. The boundaries, once traced with careful lines, were now softened with subtle washes and delicate hatching, producing a sense of continuity rather than division. Each stroke of the quill or brush was measured and unhurried, moving with the rhythm of imagined tides and the quiet slopes of distant hills. The transition between coast and water was never abrupt. It suggested a natural flow, as if the land slowly descended into the embracing calm of the sea. Shadows and shades were applied with restraint, enhancing depth without ever drawing attention. Gentle gradients of color indicated the shallows and the deep, shifting subtly across the surface, allowing the mind to perceive variation without effort. The eye could wander over these areas for long periods, tracing contours without noticing, observing movement without urgency. Every subtle mark contributed to a harmonious dialogue between earth and water, the edges of each softly echoing the curves of the other. Small inlets and bays were carefully considered. Their forms were suggested rather than defined, arcs and curves blending with the surrounding coastline in quiet continuity. The hand of the cartographer moved slowly, sometimes pausing to watch the ink settle, adjusting the pressure to deepen a line here, lighten a shade there, creating an impression of gentle ebb and flow. The effect was calm and restorative, inviting prolonged observation or simply a drifting gaze. Along the coasts, thin, undulating lines hinted at surf or shallow ripples. These were never sharp or detailed. They were subtle gestures, delicate marks that suggested water meeting land without insisting upon recognition. The repetition of these gentle arcs created a rhythm, a soft cadence across the page, echoing the pulse of tides imagined far beyond the confines of the parchment. Islands and promontories were integrated into this blending process. Their shapes were adjusted so that the surrounding waters seemed to embrace them naturally. Light shading suggested depth around each form, a quiet dialogue between solid and liquid. These features were not highlighted or dramatized. They existed as part of a seamless pattern, reinforcing the continuous calm that carried through the entire map. The cartographer's brush dipped gently into diluted ink, layering soft washes over certain coastal areas. Each layer was applied slowly, allowed to dry, then revisited with subtle enhancements. The process was deliberate and patient, never hurried. Colors merged gently, hints of green or muted ochre touched the land, while pale blues and soft grays indicated the shifting shallows of the sea. The interplay was minimal but deliberate, producing a visual unity that invited the eye to wander without attention or effort. Currents were implied through faint, flowing lines that curved along bays and inlets. Their forms were unassuming, subtle suggestions of motion that connected one region of water to another. These lines provided cohesion, a thread weaving through the open seas, echoing the gentle ornamentation that lined the edges of the map. Every arc and curve reinforced the soft meditation of the page, contributing to a serene rhythm that could be absorbed unconsciously. Along the edges of land, small textural hints suggested sand or pebble beaches. These were minimal, almost imperceptible, but they contributed to the tactile sense of place. Each addition was placed with care, respecting the emptiness of the seas beyond, the negative space serving as quiet counterbalance to the detailed yet understated marks. The hand moved slowly, pausing often to observe, allowing the page to settle into a quiet equilibrium before adding further marks. Reflections of imagined sunlight or moonlight were suggested by subtle gradients in ink and wash. Light played across shallow coves and gently curved shores, producing soft glimmers that enhanced depth without contrast. The movement of the cartographer's hand mirrored these reflections, following the natural flow of curves and gradients, creating a calm interplay of light and shadow across the map. Even the smallest channels, which meandered quietly inland from the coast, were treated with patience. Lines were softened to fade into surrounding textures, never abrupt, always flowing naturally with the land. The interplay of these minor features with the broader contours created a sense of completeness, a quiet coherence that was satisfying to behold yet required no active observation. In deeper bays, faint strokes suggested subtle waves or currents. The lines followed the contours of the coast, echoing the patterns established in shallows and along inlets. This repetition of gentle movement linked various parts of the map together, establishing visual continuity that encouraged the eye to wander without effort, to move across the page as though drifting upon calm water. The subtle integration of seas and shores also allowed the previously drawn ornamentation along the edges to resonate with the interior spaces. Small motifs and gentle patterns now seemed to respond to the flow of land and water, creating an encompassing harmony. The map was no longer a collection of separate details. It was a single, continuous field of quiet observation and careful attention. As the candlelight shifted with the soft breeze, the interplay of shadow and wash added depth to the blending areas. Tiny specks of dust drifted slowly in the room, catching the glow and reflecting faint highlights across gentle gradients. These quiet, almost imperceptible movements mirrored the gentle waves and curves on the page, adding a living quality to an otherwise still scene. The hand of the cartographer moved across the parchment in a rhythm that had become almost automatic, guided by the eye's quiet response to the blending of forms. Each motion reinforced the calm unity of land and water, the inner coherence of the map mirrored by the mind's own slow wandering. No aspect demanded attention. All contributed to an overall sense of balance and repose. Gradually, the distinctions between shorelines, inlets, rivers, and open waters softened further. The page became a continuous expanse, where the boundaries between land and sea existed only as gentle suggestion, inviting the viewer to drift along the flowing forms. The process of blending continued with patience, every addition reinforcing the overarching sense of calm and completeness, preparing the page for the final quiet reflections to come. The map, now complete in its quiet composition, radiated a gentle unity across every inch of parchment. The distinctions between land and sea, once clearly traced with careful ink, had softened into continuous, flowing forms. Hills, valleys, rivers, and shores merged with delicate washes of muted color, each feature part of a seamless whole that invited prolonged observation without insistence. There was no urgency in the scene, no sudden contrast to catch the eye. Instead, the entire expanse felt balanced, harmonious, and entirely at rest. Soft gradients suggested the rise and fall of distant landscapes, blending into the shallow curves of rivers and inlets that wandered unobtrusively toward the open sea. The eye, if it chose to follow them, could drift along these pathways slowly, tracing the quiet rhythm of shapes and shades that mirrored a calm, gentle world. Islands and peninsulas seemed to float serenely, embraced by waters that flowed around them in uninterrupted arcs. The subtle textures applied across forests, hills, and coastal areas now spoke of a deeper coherence. Leafy patterns and faint strokes of vegetation blended naturally with soft hillsides and shorelines, creating a sense of continuity rather than distinction. Each element respected its neighbors, leaving spaces between forms to breathe, to allow the mind to wander across the page without strain. Along the coasts, the waves were suggested in faint rhythmic lines, undulating in harmony with the soft curves of sand and rock. Currents and ripples hinted at movement without motion, patterns that could be observed or ignored, depending entirely on the attention of the viewer. These details, subtle yet purposeful, contributed to the overall impression of quiet and patience. Light, falling from imagined sources above, traced gentle shadows across the textured surface. Faint glimmers hinted at shallow waters, sunken sandbanks, or gentle slopes inland. These touches were so restrained that they enhanced the sense of depth without calling attention. They offered a suggestion of dimension, a quiet acknowledgement of space and form, blending seamlessly with the calm expanse that occupied most of the page. The cartographer's hand had left traces of care in each corner, yet none dominated the whole. The ornamental motifs, softly drawn along the margins, now harmonized with the central forms. Creatures, faintly inked in hidden spaces, appeared as soft companions rather than focal points. Even the smallest embellishments respected the balance of the composition, contributing to a restful symmetry rather than a detailed narrative. As the eye drifted across the map, the connections between features revealed themselves in gentle succession. Rivers met the sea in quiet arcs, hills sloped into valleys that hinted at forests, and inlets embraced the tiny islands scattered along the coast. These relationships were observed, understood by the mind, but never demanded focus. The map could be appreciated fully without active attention, its serenity extending to anyone who lingered, letting their gaze settle softly upon it. Shifts in color, from pale ochres to muted greens and soft blues, were gradual and unhurried. No sudden transitions disrupted the visual flow. All hues flowed into one another with a patient hand. The blending of tones suggested time itself stretching across the surface, each moment given space to exist without haste, each feature softly anchored in the calm rhythm of the whole. Even the texture of the parchment contributed to the quiet impression. Subtle fibers caught the faintest suggestion of light, emphasizing the gentle unevenness of the page without drawing attention. Shadows and highlights danced in soft accompaniment to the inked forms, adding an almost imperceptible liveliness to the otherwise still scene. This natural variation enhanced the immersive experience, as though the page itself breathed slowly in time with the observer. The cartographer, seated in a quiet room with a single candle flickering, had long since left the page, yet the energy of patient attention remained. Every line, wash, and shade testified to hours of careful observation, each one contributing to a sense of timeless presence. The map was no longer simply a depiction of imagined lands, it was an enduring field of calm, a world existing for the quiet pleasure of being observed. The harmonies of water and land now extended across the entire map. Bays curved into rivers, islands nestled within bays, hills sloped gently toward the coast. Forests shaded gentle valleys, and cliffs met calm seas in soft embrace. The interplay of all these elements created a meditative unity, an experience of completeness without requiring comprehension or effort. Small details, almost invisible, added to the texture. Faint lines suggesting ripples in a pond, a barely perceptible hint of stones along a riverbank, tiny undulations in forested terrain. These were not focal points, merely gentle contributions to the larger pattern, subtle gestures that encouraged the eye to wander and the mind to rest. As the candlelight dimmed, shadows deepened, emphasizing the soft gradients of color and the gentle curves of the land and sea. Dust drifted slowly in the air, reflecting occasional glimmers of light that moved across the map like whispers of motion. The effect was hypnotically calm, a quiet reminder of the continuous, unhurried passage of time within this tranquil world. The viewer, if present, could trace these flows for as long as desired, or simply let the forms fade softly from awareness. The map, in its entirety, offered a gentle immersion into a landscape that existed purely to be appreciated, without expectation, without urgency. Its quiet harmony prepared the mind and senses for rest, carrying the observer gradually toward a state of calm, where details mattered little and the rhythm of observation itself became the focus. Every feature, every line, every shade contributed to a final serenity. There were no sudden gestures, no interruptions, only the continuous, gentle presence of land meeting water, color blending into color, and pattern merging with pattern. The map became an extended meditation, a visual lullaby that invited the mind to drift freely, uninterrupted by distraction or demand. From the outer edges to the central expanse, the map now existed as a cohesive, restful whole. The eye could travel endlessly without fatigue, following curves and gradients that interwove quietly. Hills, rivers, forests, inlets, and islands existed in soft concord, each element respected, each form balanced against its neighbor. Time felt slower here, measured by observation rather than hours or minutes, and the sense of calm was complete. In this gentle finality, the map seemed to breathe in unison with the observer, a quiet companion guiding the mind toward repose. The composition no longer required attention. It offered presence and balance, a soothing field of shapes, textures, and colors. The hand that had drawn it was absent, yet the careful rhythm of creation lingered, echoing in each curve and shade. You don't need to keep listening anymore. The story can fade into the background now, becoming softer with every moment. If you're still awake, that's perfectly fine. There's no rush and nothing you need to remember. Just let your breathing slow down. Let your thoughts drift where they want to go. And allow the quiet of this night to settle around you. This story will remain here, gently playing while you rest. Tomorrow night, a new night will be waiting for you, and it's one you won't want to miss. And if sleep hasn't arrived just yet, you can quietly return to one of the previous nights, and let those stories guide you instead. For now, sleep well.